CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to a very special episode of our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Prof Moyo. I'm very excited today to have this conversation that will be focusing on several elements of what we could call movement building, but within the perspective of participatory grant making. I'm joined by three colleagues. I'm joined by Tyler from the Karibu Foundation, who is going to help us navigate the conversation on one of the programs that they put in place, working with a set of social movements across Africa to try and find new ways of doing grant making from a participatory perspective. But the initiative also involved an involvement of a core group, and we have two colleagues from the core group who are joining us in the conversation today. We have Mercia Andrews representing the Rural Women's Assembly Southern Africa, and Ogo Chukwudi, who is with TrustAfrica. Welcome to the conversations, Tyler, Mercia, and Ogo.
Thanks, Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure for me to have this conversation with all three of you. Of course, Tyler and I are going to try and host this conversation. We want it to be as free-flow as possible, as critical as you can, but also as informative. Especially given that the world of social movements and the world of participatory grant making in other quarters is called trust-based grant making is something that is very new, and I think that you and others have actually been experimenting with certain models, and one of them is the Karibu Foundation project that is called the Karibu New Realities Grant project, and this was a pilot project which started in 2021, and I think its lifespan was to come to an end in 2024. So I want to start with Tyler and ask Tyler to set the scene and speak to why this project, what led to its emergence, what were the gaps that you were trying to close, and how did you go about putting it in place. Then we'll get to hear from the core group in terms of their involvement. Tyler, if you could give us the context and the background to the project.
Absolutely. Thank you, Becky. It's really good to be here, and it's really exciting for us to get a chance to tell the story of what we've built over the past few years with different movement actors in Africa. As Becky mentioned, I'm working with the Karibu Foundation in Norway. Karibu is a private family-based foundation who works to support brave, courageous voices from the global south who are lifting up alternatives to the current paradigms of power, distribution, and development. And as part of that, our mandate has always been to think of grant making as not as just doing good, but it's challenging a concentration of wealth, which is actually a sign of injustice that's taking place in the world. And for years, our grant making has always been very related to ensuring that voices from the global south were in rooms of power, migrant communities that were at the UN who were willing to challenge rooms of power and say nothing about us without us. And for us, it's been a very natural part of our grant making to ensure that these brave voices, these critical voices, were in spaces of power. But part of that also means a reflection of our own work and realizing that as a global grant maker, we are a room of power. We have privilege, we sit on wealth, and we are also part of the problem. And that also means that we need to take a critical look at ourselves. So in 2021, right in the middle of COVID, when we saw that the space for activism, the space for social movements was shrinking even more than it ever had been before, we initiated this pilot, the Karibu New Realities Grant. And what this was a moment for movements on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa to come together from across the continent to build a new grant-making program from scratch. So Karibu convened a group of 7-8 individuals from across the continent who are coming from different movements, coming from civil society groups, coming from different ages, different political backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, and convened this group to build a new grant-making program from scratch, to find out what the needs on the ground were for movement actors, for brave, constructive troublemaking groups who were challenging the status quo, and to build this completely from scratch. Part of this was also the Karibu board being willing to give away their decision-making power. This group not only built the grant program from scratch, but they also made the decisions about which actors in sub-Saharan Africa would receive the funds. So it was really a fundamental change in how we understand grant making, in that power was being moved to movement actors on the ground, and Karibu was taking a step back in order for the movements to identify the biggest needs on the ground. And as you said, this is it's been a 2.5-year journey for us, and I'm really thrilled that my teammates here, Mercia and Ogo, are with us in this conversation, because they're really the ones, along with the rest of the core group, who have built this over the past few years.
Thanks, Tyler. And of course, you raised so many issues that we'll get to discuss, issues of around, democratizing power, for example, and the extent to which during these last 2 years that has been achieved, and some of the limitations, of course. When you start a program, you plan certain things, but it never happens that you get it all right. We'll be keen to hear, what worked, what did not work, but also to hear also from the perspective of the social movements themselves, especially around, how they came into the process, but also what they brought on board and what their experiences were. My involvement over the last couple of years with another process where TrustAfrica and others were involved gave me a glance into how social movements are perceived, and the extent to which donors are either willing or unwilling to support them, either because of the structure in which they've created for themselves or the issues that they are dealing with. And so with that, I would want to invite Mercia Andrews and maybe ask you to speak to the early beginnings when you are invited into this process, because you are not going in as an individual. You are going in representing a constituency, and as far back as I know, with some of the engagements with social movements, the question of voice and agency is very, very critical. So I want to hear from you, before we can even get to the process itself and how it worked, just your initial response when this idea is actually brought to you and your constituency.
Well, so thanks for having me and having the conversation. There were two initial, I think, important aspects. The first was that I didn't select myself. Yeah. So there wasn't a self-selecting process. I didn't know about the process until I was invited. It seemed that there was a process of consultation in the region, and my name was put forward by I think various movements or activists and so on, and I was selected. So in that way, I felt quite chuffed in a way that my peers recognized, my peers not in NGOs, etc., but in social movements actually recognized me, and not only me, but the movement that I represent, to be part of this process. So that was the first, I think, important aspect. Often these things are quite self-selecting, and you try, and people become almost gatekeepers. So this was really different. Then the second part of it, when I told the Rural Women's Assembly, they were very excited. This is an opportunity. It's a different way of being in a process, and I felt I was coming into the process with their mandate, as it were, with their consent. And so I journeyed with them throughout these days of being part of this process, and I valued the experience, yeah.
Thank you so much. And Ogo, let's also hear from you. Obviously, the two of you are representing social movements, but you are also representing different regions, and each region brings different contextual requirements and realities as well. But let's hear from you, Ogo, from your perspective, how you got into the process, but also the agency and the voice that you are representing.
Thank you so much, Becky, for having me on this podcast. Just like what Mercia had said, I was nominated by my organization, TrustAfrica. I think based off on the work that we had done prior, we had this participatory grant-making initiative we were working on, the Kisi Trust Fund, and which was also a participatory process. And I was very involved in that process. So I was nominated to represent TrustAfrica, and that was how I joined. But like when I saw the the call and the application, I was happy, but I was also skeptical because shifting power, participatory grants making is something that is starting to become a buzzword, and you hear it's not practicalized, right? I hear it in theory, but not I don't see it being practicalized. So seeing this, I looked forward to what we'll be able to achieve as a core group, but I was also skeptical in terms of like shifting power and what it will entail throughout the process.
Yeah, so I'm glad you raised that, because I wanted to come back to you and Mercia and say, what are your thoughts as you are immediately given this opportunity and you are told there's this new pilot and a way of doing things, which is completely different from how traditional donors have always operated?
So I think there was for me, there was an important part of this process, because I always recall the first conversation we had. I was always on the asking side, going to donors with begging bowls. Yeah. I was never one to be on the side who could make decisions. And so my entry into this process, I think Tyler and Ogo may remember this conversation. I was clear that I wanted to be in this process with a different objective. I wanted to respond to everybody who wrote an application. Not like you've seen people write and people that nobody cares about what you're asking, nobody's interested, it's just there, it probably goes into the bin. So I wanted to have a different approach. I really wanted us to treat each application that we received in a valuable way. So that was my first, my actual commitment to be there. The second objective for me was to serve my constituency. Now, I'm part of the Rural Women's Assembly. It's small-scale farmers from remote villages. They don't have access to funding. And so I was also looking at how do we create conditions where the constituency that I represent actually have access to resources. So I went in there with those kinds of objectives. I think initially I struggled quite a bit, partly because I didn't know anything about grant making, and secondly because we said that we were going to fund social movements. And then we also realized, now, what are social movements? Who are they? And if you look in Southern Africa, and you know this well, they certainly don't come dime a dozen. So we really had to work hard to find the constituencies that we wanted to support. So I think we learned, I certainly learned a great deal.
Yeah. So Tyler, I mean, I want to come to you. We are still at the level of, the pilot being launched and the formation of the core group. If we stick with that phase, and you are hearing, these two inputs from members of the core group, and there are many others who were part of the core group who probably had also different interests and different approaches or even requirements, so to speak, because of the constituencies that they were representing, but also the regions and the issues at hand. Do you remember any areas where there were contestations and any areas where you had to almost compromise, not you as Tyler or Karibu Foundation, but as a group?
Yeah, I mean, I think with a process like this, it had to be built on both on a mandate and an ethos of that we're building the road as we go. We needed to start this journey saying that we might not have the answers, but we have to take steps forward, and that we're going to build this together. So this needed to be based on an ownership, a co-creation from the very beginning, which meant that everyone was coming into the process with very different backgrounds, different opinions, very different journeys on their own. And how do we get a team together to start building something completely from scratch? Because we all know that building the new is often a lot harder than stopping the bad. Building the new, being able to imagine and dream and build, is really hard to do. And so we spent a lot of time in those early days building trust with each other. The group was coming from 7 different countries, which are very different. Different context. What does a social movement look like in Southern Africa versus a social movement in Eastern Africa versus Western Africa? You're coming from completely different points of view and from different realities. And so a lot of it was, again, building trust, building ownership, and not least, building a space where we could create this. And that, of course, comes with its difficulties. It comes with its challenges. It's very easy for simple things to be misunderstood. For example, I can talk about early in our process, we were hoping to make this as simple of a process as possible for grassroots movements to apply. As Mercia said, some members of the group wanted to be able to respond to every single applicant who came in. And we had a disagreement of, is it our place at all to come with feedback on their application? We're also a space of power. Should we be able to come with that feedback or not? So you had those type of very concrete challenges. But you also had political challenges. Nonviolence and creative movement building, again, looks very different across the continent. And how do we get everybody on the same page to take bold decisions together? And that took time. I think the group did a pretty incredible job of thinking creatively together how we do this. The group developed their own conflict of interest and conflict of loyalties document, because we also know being embedded in social movements, it's not a conflict of loyalty, it's how we feel these movements in our body, and how do we do this in a way that can try to open up for all the movements rather than just the communities that we're coming from. And it was absolutely a journey, and I think the group would all say that the process in itself was almost equally as important as the results of what happened.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I've been part to some of the processes, and I know Mercia and Ogo that as much as you went into this space or this space selected by your constituencies, for any areas where there was a bit of cloud or unresolved maybe way forward, in most cases you have to go back to your constituency, and I can imagine the back and forth that could have happened during this process, especially where there were contestations. I mean, I'm not sure that's what happened, but I know that in most cases where movements are involved, there's always this particular attention that is given to making sure that the voices of the constituencies are represented and not one voice dominates. So I'm keen to hear how you dealt with some of these areas that Tyler has spoken about, whether you had to go back and how much of back and forth were you going to tolerate?
I don't know if Ugo wants to speak for me, then I add on.
Sure.
That's fine. I'm not sure, in the last 2.5 years, I'm not sure we had major, serious contestations. We did. So when Tyler was speaking, he talked about being, from different age groups, different demographic, different, organizations. So initially, and to be honest, when we started, meeting virtually, there was a bit of friction. You don't understand what, Mercia is saying, what Ogo is saying. And one of the things we realized early on was the fact that we needed to, one, have a physical meeting, two, create documents that would guide us in our processes. So in terms of a communication and expectations document, so that we're able to remember that we're all different and we all have different thoughts, and also just be respectful of everyone. I think so after we created that document and we met physically in Kenya, I think after the Kenya visit, it just felt like our eyes popped. Not that we didn't have disagreements, we did, but we were able to resolve things after some time. I remember, I don't know if it was cycle 1 or cycle 2, we were almost getting to a voting stage. I don't know, Tyler, if you remember the example of what happened. We were not in agreement on something, and we have never voted before in the group. There was always consensus and everyone will agree and say, I'm okay with it. We were close to getting to voting. And then I think we got back to realization and said, no, guys, we can't do this. Let's take a step back. Let's think about this, and we go again, which was what we did, and we're able to resolve the issue. So, Mercia, I don't know if you can, yeah.
So in many ways, Mercia, as you come in, it's one feature of participatory democracy. You have to, it's almost consensus-based in most cases, but let's hear what your reflections are.
I think initially, truth be told, I was impatient with some of the members in the group. She's laughing. But I am older, I'm an experienced activist, I'm a South African, I've lived through apartheid, all of that. And I struggled when people didn't know politics, as it were. Or didn't have a feel about, they had no kind of ideology and so on. I learned to be patient with people, and I think we won in the end. We took people with us. The ideology of having a methodology that was based on the poor, and making sure that we were supporting processes that were going to bring change, real change. I think that won in the end. I remember the strangest debate. Tyler was really supportive in that meeting. We had an application about support for church leaders to I think that's what we nearly voted on, to do some work in the region on Gaza. They would go from church to church to church to promote peace in the region because of the situation of African Zionism in the continent. Some people didn't understand, why should we do that? So again, you learn to be patient, and you learn that if you're going to win an argument, you must convince people. So I think in the end, we mostly won the arguments because we took time. We got to understand that we had to take people with us rather than just be confrontational. So I think after the first year, I think things went better. It was much smoother. And we also learned about Africa. We really learned about South Africa isn't the world. What happens here, the movements here, we cannot imagine that they could be in Botswana, for example, and so on. So I certainly learned a lot from the process.
So Tyler, I think I want us to move to the first cycle of grants and the second. But before we do that, I want to be sure that we exhaust this part, because the foundation is always good. And as I'm hearing, there was a lot going on in actually trying to set the ground rules, figure out how to manage conflicts if one arises, but also, what are the principles of engagement? and lots of lessons that seem to have emerged out of that. So Tyler, I know you might have some questions for your core group members. Maybe we can take some now, especially based on this first set of conversation.
No, and I think I think one of the first questions I would have from my teammates here and my dear friends is to say one of the challenges with this is, of course, it takes time. Deep democracy, deep participation takes time. And I think, Mercia, you highlighted a bit, a process like this takes time. And so I'd be curious to hear the two of you who have been part of this for 2.5 years now as we finish up the pilot and move into the next stage. I'd be curious to see how did time feel in this for you? Did it feel like as activists you were pulled out of the field where you're struggling to be part of a process that took way too much time, or was it the amount of time used for a process like this? I'd be very keen to hear what you think.
Honestly, for me, coming into this process, I didn't know the amount of time it would take. I've actually come to realize the amount of time true participatory grants making takes. So it really did take a lot of my time, having to work, after hours and just, commit a lot of my time into the process. But like we had shared during our meeting earlier this year in Kenya, during our evaluation meeting, it took a lot of time, but I'm happy with the processes. I think the first year took more time because like we have laid out, there were some processes, we needed to create new processes. So which, took a lot more time than honestly I anticipated. Cycle 2, which was much better because we already had structures in place, we already had things in place, and it was already easier to move ahead. So in terms of time, just to summarize, I didn't expect it to be this time consuming. So just for anyone listening to this podcast that is going into participatory grants making, it takes a lot of time, but patience is needed. You need to be patient. It's a process. Like we always said, we built the road as we went, as we moved, which made it even longer because we didn't have a road to move our vehicle through. We had to create that road ourselves, which took a bit more time. Yeah.
Okay, Mercia.
I agree. It took more time than I initially thought. I found we probably spent most time reviewing the applications because we really had to go back to dig to understand who were these groups. Why, that I think took quite a lot of time, and you wanted to be fair to every group. That was for me key, and that meant we had to go back and ask more questions, get more information. I think in that way Tyler also helped quite a lot in that often he did some of the spade work. If he wasn't there, that backing and the support infrastructure wasn't there, I think we would have taken much longer. The other thing that assisted us was the infrastructure that Karibu's program that they have for grant making, for us to the selection criteria, how to load the applications and so on. Those things assisted us. If we didn't have that, I think it would have taken longer. So there was some infrastructure that made it easy, but certainly it took longer than I anticipated.
Yeah. So Tyler, before you ask your second question, I want to dig a bit deeper onto what Mercia said. Whether the idea of having the core group and social movements at the center of co-creating this approach and process would have also necessitated a different way of actually doing grant making. So instead of having to spend time reviewing grants and using an infrastructure that is already in place, wouldn't it have probably be done a bit differently so that, for example, social movements actually come in and say, we don't want to use this infrastructure. We just want to give this group either through references that they know of, etc., etc. I just want to ask that question because I know that most people listening would actually want to know why would you end up using an infrastructure that is already in place and not co-create a completely different approach so that you don't spend time doing, reading through applications?
I think that's a really good question and one that we struggled with ourselves. I remember when we were in the co-creation process and we got to the stage where we were ready to start bringing in applications from different groups. We had a debate, should we do applications at all? Is this the right thing to do? We had a debate of, is the traditional North-South donor relationship, are we just recreating it in a new form? We had these big debates and very fundamental debates. And we eventually, the group moved to a point where there was a tension between how do we be visionary, how do we completely build something new, versus when do we have to be pragmatic and move forward together. And I think that's where the tension often was. When is it visionary? When do we completely build the new? And when do we just say, at this point, we have to keep moving forward? And so I think if I were to interpret, and Mercia and Ogo, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I were to interpret what they're also referring to, it's the time it would take to develop a brand new technical system to bring in applications would have taken years. And at that point, the decision was made, we'd use Karibu's systems that already exist, but revamp them in a way that makes sense for this process. And we were, Karibu was very intentional about not saying, this is the model we're using, here's the technology we're using, but the tools are here, how can we use this in a way that makes sense? And that's what the group eventually decided to do. They simplified the technology, they opened up for different forms of applications, not just written form. There was possibility for video format, there were very deep conversation-based conversations, and we used the same technical system, but used it in a completely different way that met movements on the ground in a completely different way.
Yeah, I'm glad you are raising that because, in literature, in a process like this, you end up with the criticism that, you take movements and then NGOize them or professionalize them to a point where they end up, being detached from who they are, what they do, and how they do their own thing. So I'm glad that the group actually came to a conclusion that we'll use the same system, but we are going to simplify it in a ways that would work. So, Mercia?
But we did some things differently. So I could take the call for proposals, which we simplified and so on, and I could take it to a meeting of the Rural Women's Assembly, and I could say, yeah, all of you 10 countries, this is what is possible. I could explain how they could apply. I could work with Southern African social movements. I could encourage all of them to apply, which isn't often the case. When there's a call for proposal, it's there, but there isn't often the people who they could reach and say how to do this, where to apply, and so on. So if you look at the kinds of movements that applied in Southern Africa, I think they were very, very different from what you may have had previously. I also think we tried to work through an image of who is it that we're actually targeting. And we had developed a kind of persona of a rural woman in a rural village who couldn't do this, that, and the other. And this was the kind of people we wanted the money to reach. So we tried to overcome some of the gaps. But I think the challenge, and it's a big debate that we should have as Africans, is around the nature of the movements that we have. What do we have in the region?
Yeah, good. And so we move on, Tyler, to cycle 1 and cycle 2. And Ogo was already starting to speak about some of the lessons that emerged when you now met in person. I'll be keen to hear, what are the things that came out of cycle 1 that you then took into consideration when you went into cycle 2. But I think we can start with you, Tyler. We go to each and every panelist here because you all will bring different perspectives.
So again, that's a very good question. What did we learn from cycle 1? As I said, this was a process where we built the road as we went. The group built the road as we went. And a lot of that was continual learning. So we had elements built into the process where we took lessons and adapted them quickly. So it was always adapting. It wasn't waiting till the end. And some of the lessons we learned from the first cycle of doing it was, as my colleagues had said earlier, social movements and getting money to social movements is a very difficult task for a number of reasons. There's donors that want to push them into a very formalized NGO format and are refuse to give funds unless they're in that format. That's one challenge. Another challenge is the space for civil society is shrinking drastically, and that makes it even harder for social movements to receive funds. But another thing we noticed is maybe we were asking the wrong questions. Maybe we were not asking enough questions about movement building, challenging power, asking enough questions about how we collectively work together to touch the systemic issues. And in some ways, that was one lesson we learned quickly after the first cycle, was that in order to reach movements, we need to think about the ecosystem of social movements, because social movements turn on and off like a light switch in the moment that they're needed, in the moment when this is a particular time. They're not steady, they're not firm. All of them are not completely the same. So how do we support an ecosystem that can allow groups to activate when they need to? And so we started asking some new questions in the second cycle. And that also included bringing in more people into the group who are embedded in social movements who could bring in those perspectives.
Yeah, I was keen to hear what the gap was, because I see that in cycle 2, you actually revised the core group based on lessons from cycle 1. So what were some of the gaps that you felt? But I would also want to maybe take you back to the foundation phase, because we are speaking about the core group, but we still haven't said who the other members of the core group were, or the constituencies that they represented. So that would be useful, maybe Mercia and Ogo, as you come in terms of the gaps that you were closing and some of the lessons that you also took from cycle 1. So we can start with you, Mercia, then we go to Ogo.
So I think when we started, I think the regional spread wasn't very good. We didn't have enough, I think, French speakers. So it meant that initially we decided we were not going to take applications from French-speaking countries. If you recall, we had a problem with Portuguese and so on. So already we were, through our composition, excluding constituencies that should have been in the group. So that, I think, we recognized as quite a big gap. I also think that we had an idea of having young people, the youth constituency, the religious sector, like that. We had some the peacemaking sector as well amongst us. So it was youth, religion, rural, philanthropy came from the TrustAfrica groups, East Africa. We didn't have sufficient implantation further in Africa as well. So we were quite restricted, as it were, in that way. I think that my own view is that the feminist aspect was also quite limited. We didn't have enough. I represented the Rural Women's Assembly of Southern Africa, but we've never claimed to be feminists. So that's the difference that we try to make as well. We also, I think, didn't sufficiently have enough spread of urban struggles and urban movements as part of the group. And I think even for me, the youth component was not sufficiently a radical youth that was part of our ecosystem that we constructed, as it were. So when we reorganized the group, I liked the fact that the DRC was present and they brought an energy of young people in struggle more than we had previously. So I learned, it was an exciting, and he came with French, so that made a very big difference. And then we also brought in the Indian Ocean, and so we brought in the Indian, Madagascar came, and so we brought in the environmental and extractivist aspects that was missing in the previous things. I still think the urban struggles could have been filled differently, but I stopped it.
Ogo, back to you. Mercia, I would want to hear whether your ideology frustration was sorted at the end, but we'll come back to you. Good. So, Ogo, over to you, your own reflections as well.
Okay, thank you. One of the things I think Tyler and Mercia hasn't, or maybe Mercia did not add, is that in cycle one member had to drop for reasons beyond her control, which would have greatly improved our group, because of her background, feminist, the demographic, and whatnot. I think for me, one of my challenges from cycle one, and I remember during our debrief, I felt really bad, because one of the reasons why we came together to form this core group was, to reach out to more social movements who haven't had the opportunity to access funds, through, traditional grants making models. So one of the things was the lack of direct involvement of social movement, as most applications we received were from NGOs and CBOs, and just, one-off projects, which wasn't what we were looking at supporting. We're looking at supporting movement groups who were directly involved in challenging systemic issues. There is that. And I think for me, the second one is, because we were trying to be different, we were trying to, be creative and innovative, we decided to do videos, right? To accept applications through videos. And I would say, I don't know, but I don't think that was a good idea looking at it, because we received just one. But we were going with the notion that, movements are too busy on the ground, they don't have time to write, maybe they just want to just do a video. But we fast realized that didn't work. I think so. For me, those two were one of the challenging things for me for cycle one. And just to reiterate what Mercia has said, I'm really happy with how we were able to come together and be honest with ourselves after cycle one and just state what didn't work. So, for example, we talked about, adding people who would enrich the group, in terms of language, in terms of the feminist lens, in terms of the environment. And I learned so much from Zoe and Ghislaine, who were added to the group. And I'm so happy that we made that decision. And then we raised our voice and said, we needed to add 2 extra people.
Yeah, great. Mercia, quickly on the ideology question. Then now I want to go to Tyler for a legal related question.
I think in the end, I feel people shifted. They shifted quite a lot, and I sometimes was amused when some of the colleagues would send me a little text, would say, I was actually in my first march in Nairobi in the last days. So I said, it was really interesting how people themselves changed without any more pressure. I think we just kept working at building a collective, and people themselves shifted. And I think that for me was really, really interesting. Even now, when there were struggles in Kenya, people would say, I was in that struggle. So it's been really great, I think, how people shifted.
We'll move very soon to the evaluation report and some of the the recommendations and stuff, and you're already speaking to some of those. But Tyler, I have a practical question here about the process. So in cycle 1 and cycle 2, the Karibu board still played a role in terms of the legal elements of it. What would happen in a situation where the core group agrees on a particular grant, but the board does not agree with it?
So the Karibu board recognized early on that in order for this process to be genuine, in order for it to be movement-led, and in order for it to not be a top-down process, we had to step back as much as we possibly could. The board had to give away their power. At the same time, the Karibu board, it's a Norwegian foundation, and under Norwegian law, the board is required to approve the grants. So there's a tension in that process. So the board said pretty early on that we will trust the groups, and we will give the groups the power to decide what's going to happen. And then afterwards, after the group decided, the board approved all the grants that went through formally, and everything was paid out in that sense. We had mechanisms built in in the event that there was some form of disagreement between the core group and the board. This time it didn't happen at all. It was a very fascinating process to follow. It could have happened, and in the future it still might happen. But we had mechanisms built in where we had a group of African activists that Karibu had been working for years with, who could play some sort of role between the two groups in order to make sure that there was communication there. But in this sense, it didn't happen. In this sense, the board was able to approve all the grants with no problems. And yeah.
Yeah, great, thanks. I want us to move to, what the evaluation report says. I mean, in summary, I read somewhere where it says the process was not easy. Over the 3-year period, you had frustration, there were moments of joy, moments of confusion, and moments of the unknown. So maybe, Tyler, you could take us through what are the main takeaways from the evaluation, and then we can discuss some of those elements. I mean, there are very specific recommendations that I saw, which are very interesting for us to unpack.
Yes, so the evaluation report that was written, the core group also had the ability to design the evaluation process how they deemed fit. So there were very little demands from the Karibu board side of what this evaluation needs to look like, what needs to be covered, what needs to be brought along, which in some ways was part of the hard part. In some ways, maybe there would have been in some ways it would have been easier if there was a clear, this is exactly what we're looking for. But the group was able to build a evaluation process that was designed around the idea that we've built a vehicle. It might not be this group who drives that vehicle. This vehicle might look different, but we need to take a critical evaluation of everything we've done in order for this vehicle to be even stronger in the future. And in the evaluation report, they focus very much on the idea of 3 different things. That we needed to take an evaluation of our internal processes as a core group, the routines internally, how smoothly that went, the tension points, the political differences, the ideological differences, the time differences, the language differences. And the second part was a critical look on the grant making itself. How are the decisions around the grants made? What were our routines there? How did that work out? And then the third part that was part of that was also taking a critical look on what type of change came out of the brave actors on the ground who were actually doing the work. What type of systemic change, systemic contributions did these funds from the KNRG contribute to? And these were the 3 elements that we really focused on in this evaluation report.
Okay, great. I mean, I saw that, like you were saying, there are some recommendations that speak to making sure that there are internal processes that Karibu itself must focus on, intersectionality and others, but also the need to retain strong focus on movement building as one of the key areas where social movements have to deal with issues of movement ecosystems and power building, among others. But also there was this thing also around the need to rotate memberships and all of that. So there's a lot that is in there that I would want us to potentially just unpack one by one and hear from also the core group what your reflections are on the evaluation, because you were part of it, and if there are things that were to be done differently, what will those be?
Yes. So.
Okay.
Ogo, you can start first. You go. Yes.
If there are things I can change, okay, I think I'll say one thing, and I don't think it's something that has come up. We haven't talked about the administrative burdens in terms of financially.
Yeah.
Yes, it's good, bringing together a group of African activists, to co-create this grant-making program. But we also, because of how transparent the whole process was, we also saw how financially expensive it was, just coming together and working on this program. So you have yourself thinking, do we really need to spend this much money on coming together and doing these things instead of putting it back to this movement who really need the funds? But then again, how do we what other process can we create where we're still able to do a good job? So we're still able to create this participatory model that we're trying to do. So we had the issue of, financial constraints, because yes, Karibu, provided the funds, but also the funds were limited. So we had ourselves thinking, do we open it up to, external funding, but with external partners have the same ideology as ours? Would they have our values? So these are some of the things that, we've been, we have had a conversation about in terms of, what can we change? Do we reduce the number? Do we not, pay stipend in quotes to the activists who have been involved in this process, But then when you think about that, you're also thinking about, like, one of the challenges we mentioned was how burdensome the applications were, because we received tons of applications between cycle 1 and cycle 2. When you reduce the number of the core group, how are we able to manage to, go through this? So, I think there's a ripple effect in everything when you say, oh, if you don't do this, you do this. If you don't do this, you do this. So I'll say for me, that's one thing. I don't know, Mercia, you can add on.
An important aspect, and maybe Tyler gave this, and Karibu gave it a little bit more thought. I think we would have taken much longer as the core group if we didn't have the administrative support that Tyler provided.
Yeah.
So he did a lot of the schlep work, as it were, behind the scene work.
Yeah.
And I think we didn't sufficiently calculate how many days does that actually take, how much longer would it have taken us, and so on. So I think that's one aspect. So at some moments we may have romanticized participatory grant making without seeing the whole picture. Because I think we've come to realize that grant making isn't simply giving out the money.
Yeah.
Grant making is also a whole range of other aspects that go with it, and so on. Yes. So that part, I think, is something that we need to discuss. I also think the ways of following up. I remember us having all these conversations with some of the grantees, as it were. There were some, I don't know, Tyler, I can't actually remember the figure, and perhaps you know this now, what were the losses? Did we have 100% returns on all our
investment,
or it slipped me so I don't know, and it would be good if you comment. But there were times when I kind of told myself, I would be very happy after phone calls with some of these grantees if we come out of this process with 85% success and 15%, I don't know where the money went, but we would have done well. So I think some of that parts we also didn't fully take on board initially, and perhaps those are some things that we need to look at a little bit more. My big question is still the question of social movements, because I do think if we were, and at some point we did a pie graph of the type of movements that we actually supported, I do think that the numbers of social movements and movement building processes that we actually reached were fewer than what we had anticipated. And I think we need to perhaps also, we try to discuss those things and develop arguments and so on around it, but I think some more thought around that would also have assisted us.
So Tyler, maybe you could help us with that in terms of the success rate, if you do have the figures. But I also see that as part of the evaluation, there's a section of open questions that still need to be considered in a new model. And one of them has to do with partnerships and inviting potentially other new donors to this. And I'm assuming, obviously, it's donors who would fit similar values, have similar interests, and they are willing to also cede power. So as you respond to the question of success rate, can we also deal with this issue of partnerships? Because I think, it's partnerships from the donor's perspective, but it's also partnerships from the side of the social movements. I'm hearing that, as much as the focus could have been on social movements, you probably did not reach as many as you had anticipated. So what are the thoughts going forward in addressing that potentially open area from your side, but also from the side of the core group as well?
So I'll respond first to one, if I can, another challenge that wasn't mentioned here, and then I'll jump into your questions, Becky. I think one thing that we found out along the process is that we don't have the perfect model. We haven't cracked the code that this is now suddenly the heavens open up and we figured out all the answers. We found that we've tested something out. There are a lot of parts of it that work really well and parts that need to be strengthened. I think that is important for us to acknowledge, and the core group acknowledges that too, that there will always be ways to do better, and that's why we need to continue doing this work and continue doing this. Another thing I think we found out very quickly is no matter how hard you try to move power will always be there in some way, shape, or form. And there's power dynamics that end up in a group like this as well, that the group had to navigate and to consider power and privilege within the group itself. So that's also another element that we started to dissect but needed to spend even more time dissecting is how does power transform in different ways. In terms of your question of the success rates on the ground as such, I think the group said pretty early on too that systemic change takes time. It takes significant time. And if there was a request for every group that this grant-making program supported to have solved every riddle and stopped every systemic issue from the work that they did in that period, it wouldn't be possible. So the group said pretty early in everything that change takes time, and this is a contribution to change. In that sense, it's hard to directly say what the success rate is. If we've started a ball rolling, if ripple effects are happening, those are the things that we need to keep following. Those are the things we need to see because systemic change is so deep. That being said, we did start mapping out what type of change effects took place. We started mapping out, is change taking place within the movement itself? Is change taking place between the movements? Is changing taking place on a regional scale, or is it taking place on a global scale? And we started getting more stories of what that looks like. So success is hard to measure, and that's probably something we've also learned from this process. But we also acknowledged very openly and honestly with each other that we can't have an expectation that every single one of these grants is going to solve every issue that they're challenging. The work is too hard, and these movements are under so much pressure to be able to do that. The partnership question. So Karibu is in a very privileged position where we were able to use the resources that we were given and try to redistribute them in a new way. We had our own resources that we could do something like this. So the question, when the group started pondering, is there room for partnership, it became more of an issue of Karibu's a small little actor in the field, and we've done something that we've taken steps to try to build the new. And is it possible that maybe other funders out there would like to channel something through this process because we've built something and have the evidence to show what works and what is challenging? So it's more of a question, how do we not reinvent the wheel? How do we not do this again and again and again? But how do we build on the learnings that's being done? And especially when there's a huge wave of participation, that's the new tag word, how do we do this in a way that's genuinely owned by the movements and genuinely owned by activists on the ground?
Yeah, I want to, we are about to start winding down, but I want to touch on this other thing, which is that if you look at other groups that are doing something closer or similar, for example, let's take the Black Feminist Fund, for example. Their approach on grant making would be to have a long-term perspective where part of the money is used for long-term funding. So this would be multi-year flexible grants. But there's also possibility to actually attend to immediate issues. And what I'm getting from this process and the evaluation is that there might be need to rethink a bit of your approach there, because your cycles seem to suggest that you are only attending to a short term. Yeah. But the fact that the process of dealing with grants takes longer means you end up, missing the immediate, and you end up dealing with things that probably are outdated and things like that. So I just want to get your thoughts, all three of you, on this issue around, multi-year, funding versus immediate, but also taking into consideration the financial limitations that are also raised in the report about Karibu, and which is why there's a need to also invite other. So it's a very difficult and challenging process that you got into, but it's bringing out some of these contradictions, but some of these ways that might actually open up possibilities for the future. So we can start with Ogo, come to Mercia, and then we go to Tyler.
Okay, thank you so much, Becky. There's one thing I always used to tell my colleagues in the core group, that we can't do everything. That is why, if you look at the evaluation, we have a set of open questions, and we have, talked about this in depth in terms of our model. We talked about we can't, the 6 to 12 months projects that we have, timeline that we have placed on this project. We felt that it's a bit too short, to feel real change, and in terms of when you're supporting movement groups, and also responding to urgent matters. So I feel like we need to decide and just put down and say, okay, this is the direction we would like to go. We are not, for example, an urgent action fund who gives, urgent, the next day, the next week, the next month. They have a process. And like you've also talked about, the financial constraints we are currently facing. We've left this as an open question because it's something that we believe, especially the multi-year funding, we believe that is important. And we believe that is something to be thought about by the Karibu Foundation when, they eventually, make this KNRG a project, something they need to think about multi-year funding, which would also even reduce the burden of reviewing 250 applications almost every year. Yeah.
Okay, Mercia.
So we discussed this issue of multi-year funding, sure. So some of the points that you raised, we certainly discussed, and we were conscious, as Tyler had said earlier, there was throughout the period, there was a recognition that this is an experiment. We are seeking to explore something new, develop something new, and that in our conversations as well with the people who are applying, we should make the point. And we debated the issue of multi-year granting, what's going to happen next, what do we say to people, and so on. So I think the issue is always, unlike the African Feminist Fund, to have a long-term perspective would be wonderful.
Yeah.
It would. It's certainly what would be useful. But I think to be able to have that kind of perspective, I think you need to be much more rooted on the ground to know the partners. And that means we're going to have to experiment with a Karibu shorter fund to be able to say, aha, that organization in this country or that country, that's a partner that we could be journeying with, and so on. So I think it's an experimentation that could work at different ways. I do think the whole issue of granting at this moment where we are in the world today is probably facing some of the biggest questions that it has to deal with in the coming period.
So Tyler, as we end, I want you to reflect on this. So, you know, you're experimenting with so many things, but two of them for me is participatory grant making, which is a new thing, is framed within all sorts of approaches, decolonizing philanthropy, decolonizing grant making, localization, local-led development, etc., etc. So that's on the one end, that's what we are experimenting on. And that on its own is a huge project with contradictions and all of those things. But on the other, you're experimenting with how to fund social movements, which on its own is also another, you know, a different and a hard question, to actually deal with, given the character, the definition, and also the issues that social movements deal with. So what's next, you know, after all these lessons, the evaluations, the recommendations, what's next?
I think what's next is to take very seriously the recommendations that came from the core group, that this was a prototype that was built, that the learnings from this need to go further than solely Karibu. And part of it is telling the story of what we built. Karibu is a small actor on the stage. We're a tiny foundation. And so I think one thing that needs to continue happening is continual advocacy, saying that other models are possible, and people need to dare to do these models and to dare to give up their power. I think that's step one of what's next. I think step two of what's next is to continue lifting up other models that are happening. Karibu is not the only one doing this, and we would not have been able to do this without the support and the work that others have done. The core group were meeting with other African groups all along the way, saying, what can we learn from each other during this? So I think to lift up each other's models, and that's the next step. And I think for Karibu, the next step is to say, how do we move from a pilot phase to a integrated part that transforms the foundation as a whole? And our board has said that there's really no going back from this. So we're looking at every way, how can we take the learnings, everything from our current practices, what can be changed thanks from the lessons that the core group brought forward, and not least this grant-making mechanism that was built. How do you move from a pilot phase to a more concrete, institutionalized phase without making it too technocratic and bureaucratic? And that's the challenge. And it'll be taking all these lessons, breaking down a pilot container and moving it into transforming an institution as a whole. Super exciting. And I think it's something that we're really looking forward to diving into.
Yeah, so before I go to Ogo and Mercia, Tyler, I also know that, and congratulations, by the way, I also know that you spent some time with us here thinking about these same issues. And does the evaluation and your experience of the project align with the findings of the paper that you and Kira did, which, like I said, congratulations, will be published in Volunteers, which is one of the high-impact journals in the field of in the field of philanthropy. So do you see any resemblances, alignments between what you found from your research and what the evaluation and the core group has actually brought about.
I think there's a lot, and I think Kira and I would be very excited to come back sometime and talk about that research. But I think one of the main findings is that power will always be here. What do we do with it? How do we take steps to move it? How do we take that call seriously and not just talk the talk, but walk the walk? And I think that this process was very consistent in saying that building alternatives is possible, and we need to be willing to do it.
Great. Ogo, I know you are spending some time also reflecting, writing. You have taken time out of your busy work and activism to actually think and write. What's next for you, and are there any other points that you want to raise, based on the discussion that we've held so far?
Okay, thank you, Becky. So like you said, I'm currently in New York. I'm at the City University of New York. I'm an international fellowship on community philanthropy, where I'm researching on if the integration of match grants making in community philanthropy enhances ownership, agency, and sustainability in Africa. And, even participatory grants making has also been embedded in my work. And I've seen with my conversations with a lot of movement groups and community foundation on the ground, I've seen the importance of, match grants making, also participatory grants making, the importance of bringing the community to shape their own future, and how it has helped with agency, ownership, and sustainability. So that's that. But with the KNRG, I would just really like to say thank you so much, Becky, for having me, and also to the Karibu Foundation, the team, and the board. The board, I didn't mention it, but I think Tyler touched on it. I was quite impressed with the board. There is power, and I was really impressed at how they were able to let go of power and didn't make us, the core group, feel any less. We were there, we were confident, we co-created this as a group, and I'm really proud of what we've been able to achieve as a group, and I'm hopeful that other organizations would be able to look at this prototype and add on to it. There can be some iteration, and just, we can have proper bottom-up grant-making processes in our ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ogo. And of course, Mercia, let's come to you. Any last thoughts, and what's next for you?
Two small things, maybe not so small. One is also, as Ogo says, we thank Karibu and Karibu's board. But I also think, Tyler, I think it's very important to thank you, but also the person who was the director of Karibu at the time. He played quite an important role because he trusted. He actually dared to trust. He trusted you and he trusted us. So that is quite a big, and he never interfered. Well, I didn't see any hand, any kind of finger on the power, and that's quite a big issue. So that's, and I think it's also because of his experience in Africa, and that makes a difference. The last point, which is a key point, is that any of these processes that we're going to build up is going to take resources, and we must know that it's going to take resources, and that we cannot always imagine that it should be resources that should be going to one or other grantee. It is resources that we require to build something new. So for me, thank you very much. I learned a great deal. I enjoyed the journey. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And Tyler, Mercia, and Ogo, this has been an absolute pleasure for me to have this conversation. It's a three-way or four-way conversation, yes. Based in different time zones, different regions, but all culminating in this, journey that we have all traveled. We have just really scratched the surface in terms of the issues that are concerned. And so, Tyler, I will be open for us, if possible, to have a part 2 conversation, perhaps with yourself and other co-members or whoever you decide as to talk to. I'm on a journey with other colleagues as well to have a series that just unpacks social movements. In fact, as we speak now, I'm jumping on now to speaking to BRICS, that has also been leading the Zim Alliance as well as the Baraza as they are preparing for their own Baraza coming up in November. I just want to get into his mind and understand what their thoughts are, but also, the approaches that they are taking. So thank you very much to the three of you for joining us this afternoon. That was Tyler from Karibu Foundation, Mercia Andrews from the Rural Women's Assembly Southern Africa, and Ogo from TrustAfrica. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.